EVO. By the first time men stepped into the woods with rifles in their hands, the story in Fouke had already crossed a threshold that's difficult to reverse. It had stopped being something people talked about and had become something that they acted on. There's a moment in every community confronted with the unknown when patience gives way to pressure. At first, uncertainty is tolerated. It's discussed, it's questioned, it's held at a distance long enough for explanation to catch up with experience. But when explanation never arrives, when the events continue without resolution, something begins to build beneath the surface. Not panic, not yet, but something quieter than that. It's a need. The need to impose order on what refuses to organize itself. In Fouke, that need had been growing for weeks. Sightings of this monster had multiplied, patterns had formed. The woods, once familiar and predictable, had become something else entirely, an environment that no longer behaved the way it was expected to. People weren't just hearing things, they were anticipating them, they were listening for them, measuring their nights not by silence, but by the possibility of interruption. And when anticipation becomes routine, it does something subtle but irreversible. It changes the relationship between people and the space they occupy. The boundary between the known and the unknown begins to shift. What once felt external begins to feel closer and less contained, less willing to remain where it belongs. And once that boundary moves far enough, people don't wait for it to move back. They move toward it. And this is what happened in Fouke. The decision to enter the woods wasn't made all at once. It didn't arrive as a coordinated effort or a formal declaration. It emerged gradually, as individuals reached the same conclusion independently and then found themselves acting in parallel. One man takes a rifle and walks to the edge of his property. Another follows a set of tracks deeper than he normally would. A group forms without needing to announce itself, drawn together by the shared understanding that something out there has crossed into their lives. And once enough people reach that conclusion, the story changes again. Because now, the unknown is no longer being observed. It's being pursued. For 6 weeks, something moved through the woods around Fouke and refused to be clearly identified. But what followed wasn't more sightings. It was something far more revealing. Because when a town stops asking what something is and just starts trying to find it, the outcome tells you more than the encounter ever could. The great poet Henry David Thoreau once declared, "We need the tonic of wilderness. We can never have enough of nature." There are some people in Arkansas that might disagree with him. There's a difference between encountering something and deciding to look for it. One is reactive, the other is intentional. And intention changes the structure of the story. Because once people begin to search, they bring expectation with them. They define what they believe they are looking for, how it should behave, and where it should be found. They impose a framework on something that may not operate within any framework. And when that fails, it doesn't eliminate the unknown, it deepens it. Chapter 4 of our story begins now. The hunt begins. What unfolded in Fouke after the initial encounters wasn't the chaos that often follows fear, but something more measured, more deliberate, and in many ways, more unsettling. The community didn't scatter or retreat. It organized itself in a way that felt almost instinctive, as though the presence of something undefined required not withdrawal, but engagement. Men began to enter the woods at night, not alone, but in small groups that formed without any real formal coordination. They brought what they trusted: rifles, flashlights, dogs, and moved into areas where sightings had been reported, attempting to follow signs that until recently wouldn't have warranted a second look. And the purpose of these movements wasn't entirely clear, even to those participating in them. There was no shared plan, no agreed upon method for what would happen if the thing they were looking for was actually found. But the assumption was there, that it could be found. And this assumption shaped everything that followed. Because foundationally, searching requires belief, even if that belief is incomplete. It requires the acceptance that something exists within a defined space and can be located through effort and persistence. Without that belief, there's no reason to enter the woods at all. And so the search began. At first, it resembled exactly what you're probably expecting. Tracks were identified and followed, though only for short distances before the terrain made further progress impossible. The ground in many areas of the swamp didn't preserve impressions clearly, and where it did, the patterns were inconsistent enough to allow for multiple interpretations. What one person saw as evidence, another could just dismiss as coincidence. But this ambiguity didn't stop the search, it just redirected it. Attention shifted from certainty to accumulation. No single piece of evidence was enough to confirm anything, but taken together, the signs suggested something that resisted simple explanation. Large impressions in the ground, broken branches at heights that seemed inconsistent with known animals, movement heard but not seen, always just beyond the reach of the flashlight. But the dogs reacted in ways that were difficult to ignore. In some cases, they tracked with intensity, pulling toward areas where nothing visible could be found. In others, they refused to move forward at all, holding back with a resistance that suggested something present but not quite perceived. These reactions added another layer to the experience, one that couldn't be easily dismissed because it didn't originate from human interpretation alone. But still, nothing definitive emerged, no clear sighting under controlled conditions, no moment where the thing they were searching for presented itself fully and allowed the uncertainty to resolve into something concrete. Instead, the search produced more of what had already existed. Signs without confirmation, movement without clarity, presence without form. And over time, this began to have an effect, because the longer the search continued without resolution, the more the assumption underlying it began to shift. What had started as an effort to locate something tangible slowly became something else. A recognition that whatever they were dealing with might not be operating within the same framework that they were applying to it. The woods weren't empty, but they were also not yielding anything. And this distinction is critical because it suggests not absence, but resistance. Not the failure to find something that's there, but the inability to force that something into visibility on human terms. And once that realization begins to take hold, man, the search itself changes. It becomes less about discovery and more about understanding the limits of what can be found. Chapter 5. When the story escapes the town. Emerson wrote, "The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend." So, what happened in Fouke didn't remain in Fouke. At first, the spread was slow, moving through regional newspapers and word of mouth, carried by the same mechanisms that had allowed the original reports to circulate within the town. But as the story gained traction, it began to attract attention from outside the community. Reporters, curiosity seekers, and individuals drawn less by the specifics of what had occurred and more by the possibility that something extraordinary might be happening in a place they had never even considered before. This shift marked the beginning of a different kind of transformation, because once a story reaches beyond its point of origin, it's no longer constrained by the same conditions that shaped it. The people now engaging with it don't share the same environment or the same experiences or the same limitations that defined the original accounts. They approach it with different expectations, with different assumptions, and often a different purpose. And purpose changes structure. In Fouke, that purpose had been understanding. Outside of Fouke, it became interpretation. Details that had once been offered cautiously began to take on a different tone. Descriptions were sharpened, simplified, sometimes expanded in ways that made them easier to communicate and easier to consume. The uncertainty that had defined the early encounters, the hesitation, the incomplete observations, the refusal to overstate what had been seen began to give way to something more definitive, more certain, more defined, and in many ways, less accurate. Now, this is not a matter of deliberate distortion. It's a function of distance. Because when a story is removed from its context, it must be reconstructed in a way that allows it to exist independently. The environment, the conditions, the subtle details that made the original experience difficult to interpret don't travel with it. What remains are the elements that can be easily communicated, easily visualized, and easily understood. The creature becomes clearer, the behavior becomes more consistent, the uncertainty begins to fade. And with that clarity comes a different kind of authority. The release of the legend of Boggy Creek didn't create the story, but it altered it in a way that couldn't be undone. What had been a series of loosely connected encounters was now presented as a narrative, structured and shaped to produce a specific effect. The pacing, the framing, the emphasis on certain details over others, all of it contributed to a version of events that felt more complete than the original accounts had ever been. And completion, as we all know, is very persuasive. It satisfies the need for resolution, even when that resolution is constructed rather than discovered. For audiences far removed from Fouke, the Foggy Bottom film provided something that the real events had not: a sense of coherence, a version of the story that could be followed from beginning to end without interruption. But coherence has a cost, because in creating a version of the story that could be consumed, something else was introduced. A layer of expectation that began to feed back into the environment from which the story had emerged. People who came to Fouke after the film's release did not arrive without context. They came with an image. They came with a version of the creature already formed in their minds, a set of expectations about what they might see, how it might behave, what it might look like if it appeared. And those expectations shaped not only how they interpreted their own experiences, but how they described them. The feedback loop had begun. Sightings continued, but they were no longer entirely independent of the narrative that had been created around them. The structure of the story influenced the structure of the reports. Details that aligned with the established version were emphasized. Those that did not were minimized or often omitted. Now, this doesn't mean that the experiences themselves were fabricated. It means that they were filtered. And filtering changes perception. For the people who had lived through the original events, this shift created a kind of dissonance that's difficult to resolve. On one hand, the attention validated their experience. It made a movie. Come on. It confirmed that what they had encountered was significant enough to be noticed beyond the boundaries of their town. On the other hand, it introduced a version of that experience that didn't fully belong to them. It had been reshaped, it had been adjusted, made to fit a narrative that required clarity in places where the original events had offered none. And once that version takes hold, it becomes difficult to separate what actually happened from what has been constructed around it, because the story in its new form begins to influence the way that the past is remembered. And memory, once influenced, doesn't easily return to its original state. And this is the point where the Fouke story stops being just an event and becomes something else entirely. A shared narrative, a cultural artifact, something that exists not only in the woods where it began, but in the minds of people who've never even set foot there. And that's where it becomes most difficult to resolve, because the question is no longer just what was seen, but what has been created since. Chapter 6. The great Henry David Thoreau. I went to the woods because I wanted to live deliberately. In the years following the events in Fouke, the intensity of the sightings diminished, but they didn't disappear entirely. Reports continued to surface at irregular intervals, often less detailed, less urgent, but still aligned with the pattern that had been established during those 6 weeks in 1971. The creature remained undefined, existing in a space between presence and absence that allowed it to persist without ever being fully confirmed or dismissed. And this is where the story finds its long-term shape. Not in resolution, but in continuation. Because what remains after the immediate events have passed is not the creature in any measurable sense. There's no specimen, there's no definitive record that can be examined and categorized. What remains is something less tangible, and in many ways, far more durable. A shift. The woods around Fouke didn't change physically. The trees remained where they'd always been. The terrain continued to behave according to the same conditions that had defined it before the monster encounters. But the way those woods were experienced had altered. They were no longer neutral. This change didn't express itself in dramatic ways. There was no ongoing panic. There was no persistent disruption to daily life that would mark the events as something extraordinary in any immediate sense. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something more integrated. People adjusted their routines in small ways that, taken individually, might not have seemed significant, but together reflected a different relationship with the environment. Attention lingered longer at the edges of visibility. Movement at night was considered much more carefully. Sounds that would once have been dismissed were evaluated before being ignored. These adjustments didn't require constant reinforcement. They became part of habit. And habit, once formed, doesn't depend on active belief. This is one of the more subtle consequences of an unresolved event. It alters behavior not by maintaining fear at a high level, but by embedding caution into the way people move through their environment. The initial intensity fades, but the framework remains. For some, the creature became a story that could be told and retold, shaped over time into something more familiar, something that could be approached from a distance without the same immediacy that had defined the original encounters. In this form, it functioned as folklore, a narrative that carried elements of truth but was no longer constrained by them. For others, it remained something closer to experience, an event that had occurred within a specific context, one that couldn't be fully translated into story without losing the uncertainty that had defined it. These individuals didn't necessarily insist on a particular explanation. In many cases, they resisted explanation altogether, preferring to leave the event in the state in which it had been encountered. Unresolved. And this division is important because it reflects two different ways of processing the unknown. One moves toward narrative, toward structure, toward something that can be shared and understood collectively. The other remains closer to observation, accepting that not everything encountered can be integrated into an existing framework without distortion. And both persist, and between them, the story continues to exist. Not as proof, not as fiction, but as something that occupies the space between those categories, something that resists being fixed in a single interpretation. This is where the Fouke case remains. Not in the intensity of the original sightings, but in the absence of a conclusion that would allow it to be set aside. The lack of resolution doesn't diminish the event, it sustains it, allowing it to remain relevant without requiring constant reinforcement. Because a resolved story becomes static. An unresolved one continues to operate. It influences how similar events are interpreted. It shapes the expectations brought to other environments. It provides a reference point for understanding encounters that might otherwise be dismissed or ignored. In this way, the events in Fouke extend beyond their original time frame. They become part of a broader pattern of interpretation, one that doesn't rely on confirmation to maintain its presence. And that may be the most lasting effect. Not that something was seen, but that something was seen and never fully explained. When something can't be fully understood, it doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the way understanding works. It settles into the edges of perception, into the moments where certainty gives way to possibility, and it remains there. Not as a constant presence, but as a variable that can't be removed. Some things are found, some things are created, and some things simply remain. Thanks for listening to The Devil Within, The Fouke Monster, Part 2. If you have any cryptid stories you'd like me to explore, drop me a line at info@evocreative.com. And until next time, stay safe out there.